Doctors and surgeons of Reddit, what was your "this just got even worse" moment with your patients? I hope I never frickin' see this again. I'm an OBGYN resident. This happened when I was a student. 300-pound African-American female with IVF twins. Around 32 weeks gestation. Multiple medical problems. Chronic hypertension, being monitored inpatient. AM rounds, she looks uncomfortable. Said she slept in a chair, just looked very anxious for no reason, breathing heavy. Blood pressure is very, very high. We give meds. We can only get one twin's heartbeat, probably because she's so big. We move her to L&D for closer monitoring, plus ready access to ultrasound. Now she has a lot of abdominal pain, blood pressure still very high, her breathing getting heavier. Stat chest x-rays show her lungs are like completely whited out, filling with fluid from flash pulmonary edema. At the same time, her abdominal pain is getting worse and worse. Big, bright red clot falls out of her kitty. Same time, we get an ultrasound view of both fetuses. Twin 2's heart is super slow. Patient is now having a panic attack and screaming while also having a lot of trouble breathing. This is all within like 10 minutes. Stat, emergency crash C-section. Get her on the table. She starts having an eclamptic seizure. Anesthesia does rapid sequence intubation. Loud, long, steady beep. Patient goes into cardiac arrest on the table. Code blue, labor and delivery, goes out. Overheard throughout the hospital. Phones all over start blowing up. White coats and scrubs sprinting onto the floor. ICU comes running. Rapid response team comes running. General surgery comes running. A double NICU team comes running. There's like 30 people in the OR. ICU is giving chest compressions and running the code. Surgery is putting in a central line. Rapid response is setting up to shock. OBGYN is doing the C-section. I remember the attending yell, "Cut, cut, cut!" OBGYN goes skin to baby number 1 in about 54 seconds. There's blood everywhere, compressions still going while operating. Second baby comes out, very still looking. Placental abruption. The high blood pressure flooded her lungs and tore the placenta off of the uterus. NICU takes both babies. They eventually do just fine as the hospital course goes. Mom receives ROSC, return of spontaneous circulation. Her heart is now beating on its own again. Still bleeding. Massive transfusion protocol initiated. She eventually gets somewhere between 14 to 20 units of packed red blood cells plus plasma, platelets, and other stuff. Thank you for giving blood, by the way. It actually actively saves lives of people who wish they could know who to thank. Conservative surgical measures don't stop the bleeding. Cuvular uterus is diagnosed secondary to placental abruption in the setting of eclamptic seizure. Caesarean hysterectomy is performed. Uterus comes out. Patient remains intubated for about 2 days. Downgraded from SICU. Walks out of the goddamn hospital after 1 week because that's how a solid medical team handles their stuff. Now, there were a lot of red flags to indicate delivery at the beginning of this story, but she spiraled so fast. There really wasn't any significant wasted time. I swear, this OP writes for medical dramas or something. Something about the way they wrote it, the way it was laid out, I don't know, it just got my heart racing. Of course, this is a real story as well and should be treated with a bit of sensitivity, but I am impressed with how, I don't know, thrilling it was almost. Really impressive from the entire medical team. Story 2. I have many stories. One is a healthy 23-year-old male who comes into the ER with some chest pain. Normal vital signs, never smokes, normal chest x-ray. Pain started after eating something spicy. Tell him it's probably GERD. 5 minutes later, he drops dead in his bed. Start CPR and get a pulse back. Stabilized, gets CT scan and has an aortic dissection. Dies again in CT scan and never makes it to the OR. This guy's major blood vessel basically just exploded. This happens to men in their 70s with long smoking history and high blood pressure. This healthy 23-year-old had absolutely zero risk factors for this. Still makes no sense to me. Story 3. When we opened up the abdomen of this woman in her late 20s, the entire room instantly smelled like hot, rotting flesh. We were doing an exploratory laparotomy because she had such severe abdominal pain, she couldn't sit still for a CT scan, and the x-ray just suggested some free fluid in the abdomen. A paracentesis, draining fluid from the abdominal cavity, didn't really do anything, so the surgeon was kind of going in blind. But her indication for surgery was the extreme pain and the rock-hard feeling of her abdomen. When he cut her open, he saw that she was going into multiple organ failure with a ton of tissue simply rotting. The smell enveloped the room instantly. Anesthesia was gagging. I ran to grab the peppermint oil to rub on our masks. The surgeon looks at the abdomen for about 20 seconds and says, Well, anesthesia, I think she's about to crash. I imagine this pressure in the abdomen was the only thing giving her any blood pressure. She did crash, and she died right there on the table. This young woman had been an extremely heavy ice user. Her mom had started her out using ice with herself when the girl was a teenager. They figured she probably got a bloodstream infection from injections with the dirty needles, and that just spread through her body like wildfire. Story 4. My father went to hospital with chest pains. They decided to do an angiogram. Dye injected, and he's lying under the machine. The surgeon suddenly changes his procedure. Are you okay? Feeling well? Any blackouts? No, he replied, just pain. A few more docs come in and are looking at the screen. They take him to another type of x-ray machine and again are looking at him in bemusement without explaining anything. You have a blood clot the size of a golf ball floating free in your heart. It's bouncing around the valves and we would expect you to have died very quickly from this. So they give him super strong clot busters, but were concerned it might shrink enough to get jammed. A lot of experts turned up, but all went well and he had a triple bypass a few months later. That was 30 years ago. He's 87 now and can walk up steep hills with ease. Story 5. Eye doctor here. You may have heard that diabetics need to have their eyes checked regularly because diabetes is actually a blinding condition. This happened probably about 15 years ago. But this patient of mine I had noted had severe diabetic vascular changes against the retina and required laser intervention as soon as possible. Without getting into the socio-economic arguments here, she scheduled her surgery and on the day of the surgery, decided to take a work day instead of her surgery. Her job was cleaning and on that fateful day, she inhaled some of the cleaner fumes which caused her to sneeze, spiking her blood pressure. She blew the fragile blood vessels in both her eyes wide open and blood started gushing into her eyes. As you might imagine, blood is opaque. You can't see through it. She was instantly and completely blinded in both eyes in a matter of seconds. It took 3 years, multiple surgeries, and a complete lifestyle change, but this patient did recover to have actually fair but not good vision. I still see her now for her annual visits. Story 6. A little late to the party, but I'll chime in. When I was a medical student on my surgery rotation, I was working a 24 and was with the trauma team. I'm observing a simple repair of a duodenal perforation in the OR. When my trauma pager goes off, I ask my senior if I can leave to see what's going on and he gives me the go-ahead. Run into the trauma bay and a youngish gentleman is brought onto a stretcher with the lower half of his body covered in blood, but very obviously awake and coherent. He's screaming, "They shot my balls, they shot my frickin' balls, man." And they had. He had been shot 15 times all below the belt, one of which had gone straight through his scrotum. We're doing an evaluation on this distraught man when a code is called in the next pod over in the ED. That's weird. They don't usually call overhead for codes in the ED. Someone pops their head into the trauma bay. It's the patient who was brought in with this guy. Oh crap. Several of us run away from stable scrotum shot guy and are into the next pod to see a young woman lying on a stretcher receiving CPR. What happened? We don't know, she just crashed. Go to roll the patient to get her clothes off and we notice she's bleeding out of her back out of the tiniest exit wound. She was an unintended victim of the drive-by. She's now our patient. We take her to the trauma bay and immediately take all of her clothes off to perform the primary survey. She's not breathing and has no pulse. Intubate. Sure as hell, once we get her entirely exposed, we see a very small entry wound right in the center of her chest. Ultrasound confirms massive hemothorax. Place a chest tube and 2 liters of blood gush onto the floor. Oh God. We need to convert to open, says my attending. Resident I'm with immediately takes a scalpel and creates a longitudinal incision along the inferior aspect of the rib spaces, and uses a pair of medical gardening shears to clip the sternum in half. Basically, the patient has had their chest pried open horizontally in a crazy procedure called a clamshell thoracotomy. Look it up. At this point, we can visualize the heart and notice there was a clean entry and exit wound straight through the patient's heart. All of the blood and fluids we were pushing were just draining right out of her heart and into her chest. Surgical attending is performing manual cardiac massage. CPR with your hands on the actual heart. We need to go to the OR. Rush down to the OR with this patient and the attending attempts to sew up the holes in her heart. Just as she's putting the final sutures into the patient, I begin to notice the patient oozing blood from every single opening in her body. Doc, I think this patient is in DIC. Oh crap. Patient is now floridly experiencing a phenomenon known as disseminated intravascular coagulopathy, which is basically when you use up all of your clotting agents and just bleed out of everywhere. Okay, we need to close for now. Patient is transferred to the SICU where I monitor her progress for 3 frickin' weeks. She has watershed infarctions across her entire brain from how long it went without perfusion. She can't talk or move. Having end-of-life discussions with the family about a young woman who isn't even old enough to drink. I leave the service and follow her until one day I don't see her name anymore. Next day, I'm in surgery with the trauma attending, and she says, "Hey, our shooting patient went home today. She's a quadriplegic, but she's alive." "That sucks," I respond. Fast forward 6 months and I'm working in the SICU again. I bring up this patient to a neurointensivist attending because I think it's a cool story. Her eyes open so wide. "I saw that patient in the ICU and told the family she was going to die. When she didn't die, I told them she would be a quad. Then, a month ago, I had a follow-up visit with her, and she walked into my clinic with nothing to show for her experience except a scar from her thoracotomy." That must have been the craziest roller coaster for that family. To have such an insanely traumatic injury recover? It's practically unheard of as far as I know. It's also crazy that something like a random drive-by shooting can just ruin your whole life so quickly. Luckily, it didn't seem to ruin her whole life, but obviously it could have ended it. Definitely a pretty dramatic situation that it sounds like the doctors handled well, so that's good. Story 7. I am not a doctor or surgeon, but I did work in healthcare, and this was in an urgent care setting. Should have been an ER visit, though. I was assessing and taking information down for a 25-day-old newborn. The parents were very young and concerned that the baby wouldn't stop crying and never settled. I tried to calm them and reassure them, as we see this a lot. Baby seemed a bit feverish and red, so I took temperature, and it was slightly elevated. You definitely don't want to see a newborn so young with a fever, but sometimes it's not serious. I noticed one leg appeared possibly clubbed with the foot, but that wasn't what they were there for. The doctor returned after seeing them and said that the baby was going to radiology right away. That's not good. X-rays come back and it's realized that the one leg that appeared off to me was actually a broken femur. The doctor described it as, the only possible way for this to happen was someone had to have grabbed it and twisted it hard. Suddenly, we are making a temporary cast to splint this tiny, not much bigger than a bratwurst-sized thigh, and loading the car seat on a stretcher for transport. Police arrive and the grandma came crashing through the doors, screaming at these parents. She's yelling about how she's going to unalive them for hurting her grandbaby. It was a little chaotic, but very depressing. It was long ago, but I still wonder about that one. Story 8. So many. The 80-year-old who came in with a self-inflicted shotgun wound to the chest. As we're fighting to get him stabilized, the surgeons are working to plug all the holes. None of us can figure out why the guy keeps oozing blood. Then we find out he had intentionally overdosed on blood thinners before shooting himself. We kept him alive long enough to let the family come into the OR and say goodbye. The 45-year-old who came in via private car. Family drove him in rather than an ambulance. It was described as a head injury. We realized how bad it was when someone noticed a plastic grocery bag lying on the patient's belly. It contained the brains that the family managed to scoop up in the hopes we could reimplant them, and the 30-something drug addict, who also had a permanent catheter infusing a life-saving medication directly into his chest for pulmonary hypertension. He came into the ICU with pH crisis, and then we found out why. He had been injecting drugs directly into the catheter, creating a hole through which his life-saving medication leaked out. Medicine is a lot of things. Sometimes it's just tragic. Story 9. Nurse here. Midwife let a mom go through over 8 hours of the pushing stage of birth to the point the mom went into severe decompensation. Blood pressure plummets, saturation drops, fetal distress, etc. In Canada, midwives practice separately from doctors and nurses. They usually just have an agreement with hospitals to use the beds, although medical care is available if the delivery becomes high risk. Doctors take over and go in for emergency C-section. Realize the arteries in the sides of the uterus are ruptured due to pulling away from the strained uterus and extensive pushing. Baby came out fine, but they had to work on mom. Finally close her up only for mom's pressure to plummet again. They open her back up and realize another artery was bleeding, so they clamped her aorta until they could repair the damage. Her lower body didn't receive blood flow for several minutes. They replaced her blood volume at least 3 times throughout. Finally, the team stabilized her but were afraid of anything else unexpected. So they packed her but left the wound open, then sent her to the ICU. I received baby in NICU. Baby was okay. Mom survived, although didn't find out much more. Story 10. Not a surgeon, but my dad is. One patient who attempted to unalive himself was put on watch for a while. Said he was fine and slowly got taken off said watch. He asked for permission to go alone to the cafeteria and eat. Got that permission. Took a knife from behind the counter and slit his own throat. You have no idea how much blood there is in a human body until someone cuts deep. My dad described the scene like something from a horror film. Story 11. Pick one. These were all from my intern year in general surgery in the late 90s. 1. The beautiful 34-year-old woman who manned a grill for 2 days during some sort of weekend festival for her church. Her eyes got irritated from the smoke off the grill, so she asked her PMD for some eye drops. After using them for 2 days, she developed a rash. They were tobramycin drops, and the rash rapidly progressed to cover her whole body. She developed TENS, aka toxic epidermal necrolysis syndrome, which essentially means the most superficial layer of the skin, epidermis, separates from the deeper layers, dermis. This leaves a wound that is similar to the raw spot underneath a big blister, but in her case it involved nearly 75% of her skin. She also developed GI bleeding as the mucous membranes, the moist tissues that line the inside of your mouth, esophagus, stomach, and intestines, also separate and bleed. At the time, we had silver-impregnated dressings, Acticoat, that we had to wrap her in like a mummy and change every day. Despite everything we could do at the main burn unit in a huge metro area in the Midwest, she died. 2. The husband and wife were brought in at the same time, both with major flame burns. He was about 50% total body surface area, and she was about 75%. The woman was intubated at the original ER they went to. Big burns are literally hot potatoes and will get transferred to the nearest burn center ASAP when they arrive in a small town ER. She was waking up a bit when she got to our unit, and kept trying to mouth something around her breathing tube. In hindsight, I'm pretty sure it was my baby, as she miscarried about 36 hours after she was admitted. Her nurse found the fetus in her bed. She developed an arrhythmia while we were starting a new central line, big IV in the neck or chest, and we couldn't stop it, and she died. We found out later that the husband put their 2 kids in the car, then went back inside and choked her till she passed out. Then poured gasoline all over her and lit her on fire after he found out she was pregnant with someone else's baby. He also caught on fire, gasoline will do that. He survived, got multiple skin grafts, and went to jail. The kids were uninjured, physically. That was during the first 3 weeks I was a doctor. These are both terrifying, medical drama level stories. I have nothing but respect for the professionals who deal with this kind of stuff day in, day out. Surely I know it's not all this bad, but when it is, it's gotta be tough. And as such, I thank you guys. You do incredible work, and also just underappreciated. These were pretty long ones, but that's all the time we have for stories today. I hope you found them interesting or something. It's weird to say I enjoyed them because a lot were really tragic, but on some level I did in a not quite even a morbid kind of way, just like they were really interesting. I hope you found them interesting as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you in the next one.